For the first time in American history, the United States government now owns a piece of one of the world's most important technology companies, and it didn't pay a single dollar in new cash to get it. In August of 2025, the US government converted billions of dollars in unpaid grants into stock and walked away owning 10% of Intel. 8 months later, that stake was worth over $47 billion more than what it started at. Nobody in Washington predicted this. Nobody at Intel asked for this. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why the US government becoming Intel's biggest shareholder might be the single biggest move in the entire chip war, bigger than any export ban, bigger than any tariff, and bigger than anything China has done in response. Let's start with what actually happened, because most of the coverage on this got it wrong or buried the real story under political noise. Back in 2022, the US government passed something called the Chips and Science Act. The idea was simple. American chip manufacturing had fallen way behind Taiwan and South Korea, and the government wanted to bring it back home. So they set aside tens of billions of dollars in grants for companies willing to build chip factories on US soil. Intel was the biggest recipient. They were promised close to $11 billion to build new factories in Arizona, Ohio, and New Mexico. But here's the problem. Intel was falling apart at the same time. The company lost close to $19 billion in a single year. They were bleeding market share to Nvidia in AI chips, losing ground to TSMC in manufacturing, and cutting their workforce by 25%. The grant money was supposed to save them, but it came with almost no strings attached, and critics on both sides started asking the same question. If taxpayers are handing over billions of dollars, shouldn't taxpayers get something back? In August 2025, the administration answered that question. Instead of just handing Intel the remaining grant money as a gift, they converted it into stock. Roughly 433 million shares, priced at just over $20 each. Add in another chunk of funding pulled from a Defense Department program, and the final number came out to just under $9 billion, enough to buy a 9.9% stake in the company. Round it up, and you get the number everyone's using. The US government now owns 10% of Intel. That alone would be a huge story. But it's what happened next that turned this into one of the most important developments in the entire global chip war. To understand why this matters, you need to understand how rare this actually is. The US government does not buy stakes in private companies. That's not how American capitalism is supposed to work. The entire system is built on the idea that markets pick winners and losers, and the government stays out of it, unless something is about to collapse and take the whole economy down with it. That's what happened in 2008 when the government bailed out General Motors and several major banks during the financial crisis. Those were emergency rescues. Once the company stabilized, the government sold its shares and walked away. Intel is different. Intel isn't about to collapse and take the economy with it. Intel makes chips. And that's exactly the point, because in 2025, chips aren't just a product anymore. They're a strategic resource, the same way oil was in the 20th century. Every AI system, every military drone, every smartphone, every piece of modern infrastructure runs on semiconductors. And right now, the company that leads in advanced chip manufacturing isn't based in the United States. It's TSMC in Taiwan, an island that China has repeatedly threatened to take by force. So when the US government took a stake in Intel, it wasn't a bailout in the traditional sense. It was a bet that whoever controls chip manufacturing controls the next century of technological and military power, and that the US can't afford to be dependent on a company sitting 100 miles off the coast of a rival superpower. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick put it about as bluntly as a government official ever does when he said the US should get equity for its money instead of just handing out a grant. In other words, if we're going to pay for this, we're going to own part of it. That single sentence describes a complete shift in how the US government treats its own tech industry. It's no longer just regulating chip companies or subsidizing them. It's becoming one of their owners. Here's where the story gets genuinely wild, because nobody, not the administration, not Intel, not a single analyst, expected what happened next. When the deal closed in August 2025, the government's stake was worth about $8.9 billion. Intel stock at the time was struggling. The company was in the middle of layoffs, and investors weren't convinced the turnaround plan would work. Then two things happened that changed everything. First, Nvidia, the company that had spent years crushing Intel in the AI chip race, announced it would invest $5 billion into Intel and start working with them on AI infrastructure and PC chips. Think about how strange that is. Nvidia is Intel's biggest rival, and Nvidia just became one of Intel's biggest partners. That single announcement sent a signal to the entire market. If Nvidia believes Intel is worth betting on, maybe Intel isn't as dead as everyone thought. Second, and this is the part that really moved the needle, Intel landed a deal with Apple. For nearly 2 decades, Apple has depended almost entirely on TSMC in Taiwan to manufacture the chips inside iPhones, iPads, and Macs. That relationship was untouchable. Apple didn't trust anyone else to hit their quality standards. But after months of meetings between Commerce Secretary Lutnick and Apple CEO Tim Cook, Apple agreed to a preliminary deal for Intel to manufacture chips for Apple devices. This was the first time in Apple's history that a major production commitment went to Intel instead of TSMC. When that news broke, Intel's stock jumped 15% in a single day, then kept climbing until it hit an all-time high of around $129 a share. The US government's 10% stake, bought for $8.9 billion, was suddenly worth $56.5 billion. That's a gain of more than $47 billion in under 8 months, on an investment where the government put in essentially none of its own new cash. Analysts at the Kobe letter called it truly unprecedented, and it's hard to argue with that. There is no comparable case in modern history of a government stake in a private company generating returns like this fast. To put that number in perspective, think about what $47 billion actually represents. That's more than the entire annual budget of NASA. It's more than most countries' defense budgets. And it appeared on a government balance sheet not because of some new tax revenue or spending program, but because of 2 corporate deals that took less than a year to play out. For a government position that critics originally called a reckless, unconventional gamble, the numbers alone forced a lot of skeptics to go quiet, at least on the financial side of the argument. It's also worth understanding why the Apple deal specifically carried so much weight with investors. Apple doesn't make decisions like this lightly. Every chip that goes into an iPhone has to meet extremely tight tolerances, because a single manufacturing flaw across hundreds of millions of units becomes a catastrophic recall, not a minor inconvenience. For Apple to even consider handing part of that production to Intel, a company that has spent the better part of a decade missing its own manufacturing roadmaps, was read by the market as a signal that Intel's newest manufacturing process might finally be catching up to the standard TSMC has held for years. Whether that's actually true in practice still has to be proven in real production runs, but the market moved first and asked questions later, which is exactly why the valuation swing was so dramatic. President Trump wasted no time claiming credit for the deal, telling supporters that the country paid nothing for the shares and that they were now worth billions. Whether or not you agree with how he framed it, the underlying numbers are real, and they're publicly documented in Intel's own filings. Here's where most coverage of this story stops. Big number, big win, move on. But that's not the full picture, and if you only watch one part of this video closely, make it this one, because this is where the actual risk in the US chip strategy starts to show. The government's stake in Intel comes with a specific structure. It's a passive investment. That means the US Treasury holds the shares, but it doesn't get a seat on Intel's board, and it doesn't get direct control over the company's decisions. On paper, this was designed to avoid turning Intel into a state-run company. In practice, it creates a strange situation where the government has a massive financial incentive tied to Intel's stock price but limited formal power to influence how Intel actually executes its turnaround. Senator Elizabeth Warren raised exactly this concern in a letter to Commerce Secretary Lutnick. She argues that the deal handed Intel billions in value without requiring the kinds of protections that were originally built into the CHIPS Act. Things like commitments to build factories on schedule, support union labor, and limit stock buybacks. Under the original Biden-era version of the CHIPS Act, that funding came with strings attached. Under this new equity deal, many of those requirements got loosened or removed entirely. That matters because Intel's turnaround is still not guaranteed. The company lost nearly $19 billion in 1 year and another $3.7 billion in just the first half of the following year. It's still cutting a quarter of its workforce. A stock price rally driven by a couple of headline deals, Nvidia's investment, the Apple manufacturing agreement, doesn't automatically fix years of falling behind TSMC and Samsung on actual chip manufacturing technology. If Intel's core manufacturing problems aren't solved, this could turn out to be a stock price story, not a turnaround story. And if that $56 billion valuation comes back down, the government, meaning taxpayers, are exposed to that loss the same way any shareholder would be. There's also a political risk baked into this that rarely gets discussed. Even conservative economists who generally support Trump's broader agenda have pushed back on this specific move. Groups that normally champion free markets are warning that a government equity stake in Intel sets a precedent, and once you accept that the government can take a stake in one company for national security reasons, what stops it from doing the same thing to the next one and the one after that? A former Trump administration economist bluntly pointed out that even if you believe the government should invest in strategic industries, Intel is not a lean, mean, innovating machine. It's a company that has been losing the innovation race for the better part of a decade. So you have two competing realities happening at the same time. On one hand, the position has generated an enormous real financial gain for the US government in a very short window. On the other hand, that gain is sitting on top of a company with serious unresolved structural problems, a controversial ownership precedent, and a political fight over whether this was a smart strategy or reckless improvisation dressed up as a win. Now here's the part that ties this whole story back to the bigger picture, because on the surface, this looks like a domestic economic story about government intervention. Underneath, it's entirely about the chip war with China. For the last several years, the US strategy against China's chip ambitions has mostly been defensive. Export bans on advanced chip-making equipment, restrictions on selling top-tier Nvidia and AMD chips to Chinese companies, sanctions on Chinese chip manufacturers like SMEC. The entire approach was built around one idea: slow China down by cutting off access to the most advanced tools and designs. But that strategy has a hole in it, and China has been exploiting that hole for 2 years. Every time the US tightens export controls, Chinese companies find workarounds. Huawei built its own advanced chips despite sanctions. Chinese memory manufacturers scaled up production faster than expected. Chinese AI labs trained massive models on domestic hardware specifically to prove they didn't need Nvidia at all. Playing defense, just blocking China's access, was never going to be enough on its own, because it does nothing to fix the actual weakness on the American side. The US doesn't have enough advanced chip manufacturing capacity of its own. That's the real reason the Intel stake matters so much. It's not really about the stock price gain, even though that's the headline number everyone's fixated on. It's about the US government directly tying its own financial interests to whether Intel succeeds at becoming a serious, competitive chip manufacturer on American soil. When the government owns 10% of Intel, Intel's success becomes the government's success in a very literal, measurable way, and that changes the incentives at every level. It gives the administration a direct reason to keep pushing partnerships like the Apple deal, to keep leaning on companies like Nvidia to work with Intel instead of just competing against it, and to keep prioritizing Intel in future government contracts and defense chip orders. You can already see this playing out. Around the same time as the Intel stake, the administration struck an unusual agreement allowing Nvidia and AMD to sell certain chips to China, but only if the US government gets a 15% cut of those sales. Think about what that actually means. The government isn't just regulating the chip industry from the outside anymore. It's taking equity in Intel, taking a percentage of Nvidia and AMD's China sales, and using the Defense Department's own budget to fund some of these plays. 3 completely different tools, all pointed at the same goal: making sure the United States doesn't lose control of the chip supply chain to China, no matter how weird or unconventional the method looks. This is a fundamentally different kind of chip war strategy than what we've seen for the past few years. It's not just about blocking China. It's about the US government actively building financial stakes inside its own chip industry, so that America's success in manufacturing isn't left entirely up to private companies making decisions based on quarterly earnings. Whether or not you think that's a good idea, it is a genuine shift, and it's one that other countries are going to have to respond to. So where does this actually go from here? There are 3 things worth watching closely over the next year, and each one will tell you whether this turns into the biggest strategic win of the chip war or a very expensive lesson. First, does Intel actually deliver on the Apple deal? A preliminary agreement is not the same as chips rolling off a production line. Intel has promised advanced manufacturing before and missed deadlines before. Their most advanced process technology still needs to prove it can match TSMC's yields and quality at scale. If Intel can't actually produce chips at the volume and quality Apple needs, That $56 billion valuation could evaporate just as fast as it appeared, and the government stake goes from a headline win to a taxpayer-funded loss. Second, watch whether other companies follow Nvidia's lead. Nvidia investing $5 billion into a competitor was a strange, almost unthinkable move a year ago. If more chip companies start treating Intel as a manufacturing partner instead of a fading competitor, that's a sign the turnaround is real and self-sustaining. If Nvidia's investment turns out to be a one-off political favor, rather than a genuine business bet, that's a warning sign. Third, pay attention to whether this becomes a pattern. Right after the Intel deal, there was already public discussion about the Defense Department taking a similar equity stake in a rare earth materials company. If the government starts doing this across multiple strategic industries, chips, rare earths, batteries, maybe even AI infrastructure, this stops being a one-time Intel story and becomes a completely new model for how the US government participates in its own economy. That's a much bigger deal than any single company's stock price, and it's going to have implications for how markets price and political risk for years to come. If that pattern does emerge, expect a fight in Washington over how far it should go. Free market conservatives who normally support this administration's broader agenda have already started drawing a line, warning that turning the government into a shareholder across multiple industries starts to look less like strategic policy and more like the kind of state-directed capitalism the US has spent decades criticizing other countries for practicing. On the other side, national security officials are likely to argue the opposite, that chips were just the first domino, and that rare earths, batteries, and advanced manufacturing all carry the same strategic risk if left entirely in private hands. How that argument gets resolved over the next year will tell you a lot more about the future of the American economy than any single quarterly earnings report from Intel. And then there's China's response, because China is not going to sit still while the US restructures its entire chip strategy around Intel. Expect Beijing to accelerate its own domestic chip investments even further, push harder on self-sufficiency programs, and potentially retaliate against American companies operating in China the same way it's done during previous rounds of this trade fight. If the US government is now financially entangled with Intel's success, China has an even stronger incentive to make sure Intel fails to gain ground, because every dollar Intel gains is a dollar of leverage the US gains in the broader chip war. China's chip industry has already spent years building around the assumption that American export controls are permanent, not temporary. Chinese state-backed investment funds have poured tens of billions of dollars into domestic memory makers, foundries, and equipment manufacturers specifically so that no single American policy decision can cut off their supply chain again. A stronger government-backed Intel doesn't reverse any of that progress, but it does raise the stakes on the manufacturing side of the race, the one area where China has historically lagged furthest behind. If Intel actually closes the manufacturing gap with TSMC, that removes one of China's long-term strategic advantages. The fact that the world's most advanced chip production sits on an island China considers contested territory, one hurricane, blockade, or conflict away from disruption. An Intel that can reliably produce cutting-edge chips on American soil takes that leverage away, which is exactly why this story matters far beyond a single company's balance sheet. Step back for a second and look at what's actually happened here, because it's bigger than one company's stock price. For decades, the US approach to technology leadership was to let private companies compete and let the government stay in the background as a regulator. That model built companies like Intel, Apple, and Nvidia into global giants. But it also created a vulnerability. When a strategic industry like chip manufacturing starts to fall behind, there's no government mechanism to step in and directly fix it. You just have to hope private companies solve the problem on their own timeline. The Intel stake is the first real test of a different model, one where the US government becomes a direct financial stakeholder in the outcome of the chip war, not just a rulemaker standing on the sidelines. It's a model that's much more common in China, where the state has direct ownership stakes in strategic companies as a matter of policy. In some ways, taking a 10% stake in Intel is the US government adopting a page out of China's own economic playbook to compete with China. That's the real story underneath the $47 billion headline number. This isn't just about whether Intel's stock goes up or down. It's about whether the United States is willing to fundamentally change how its government relates to its own strategic industries in order to win a technology race that's going to define the next several decades. So let's go back to where we started. The US government now owns 10% of one of the most important chip companies on Earth, and that stake gained over $47 billion in value in under 8 months, without the government spending a single new dollar in cash to get there. But the real significance isn't the number on the balance sheet. It's what this move represents: the United States abandoning its hands-off approach to the chip industry and directly betting its own financial interests on Intel's ability to compete with TSMC, with Samsung, and ultimately with China's entire chip manufacturing ambitions. It's a strategy that could either restore American leadership in chip manufacturing for the first time in over a decade, or it could turn into one of the most expensive political gambles in modern economic history, depending entirely on whether Intel can actually execute. Either way, the rules of the chip war just changed. This isn't just about export bans and tariffs anymore. It's about direct ownership, direct financial exposure, and a US government that's now as invested, literally, in Intel's success as any shareholder on Wall Street. And this might just be the beginning. There are already early conversations happening in Washington about applying this same playbook to other strategic industries: rare earth materials, battery manufacturing, and possibly even AI infrastructure itself. If that happens, the Intel deal won't just be a one-time headline. It'll be remembered as the moment the US government fundamentally changed how it fights for technological dominance. I'm going to be covering exactly where that goes next, because this is moving fast, and most people are only seeing the stock price headline without understanding what's actually happening underneath it. If you want to stay ahead of this story before it hits the mainstream news cycle, subscribe. This is exactly the kind of shift this channel exists to break down.